So for the first time, absolute Martian Manhunter is aware of absolute Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman. Now, they are cameos. They're not the main focus of the story, but it's dope to see them all appearing and to see Martian Manhunter becoming aware of their existence. So, this entire story centers around the actions of the White Martian basically trying to destroy reality. It's kind of crazy, right? And one of the things to know is that the White Martian was believed to have been defeated. That's what we saw in the first volume of Absolute Martian Manhunter. What we ended up learning was that the White Martian had quote unquote survived and jumped into the son of John Jones, who is essentially the main star of the comic. And so while we have covered issue number 7, these are issues 8 through 12, which essentially wraps up the entire story. And because John had told his wife, Bridget, the fact that he was possessed by a Martian, that the Martian talks to him, as you can probably imagine, she thought he was crazy. And that led to their marriage essentially falling apart. And so in the face of all of this, John Jones being so frustrated, he actually tells the Martian he wants a day to himself. He wants to be left alone. And so this gives John the chance to go back and visit his wife and to try to reconcile in some capacity, while the Martian just kind of goes out into the world and starts jumping from one location to the next, literally taking over people's minds, looking over their experiences, different things like that. It's basically touring humanity, for lack of a better word. But then the Martian itself is caught up to by an organization called the Agency. Now, I will specify ahead of time, the Agency is ambiguous over the course of this entire comic, so we don't really get any actual explanation of where they're from outside of what it is that they're doing here. But as far as their actions are concerned, it's just simply capturing the Martian Manhunter, which is exactly what they do. At the same time, because of the fact that John's son Tyler is possessed by the White Martian, and the White Martian seemingly has the ability to manipulate the very fabric of reality itself, he ends up creating a new Martian that basically contacts John directly and calls himself Despair the Zero. The long and short of this, truth to tell going forward, the best way to view Despair is that he is, in effect, the attempt of the White Martian to demoralize and to destroy John on a very fundamental level. And it makes sense, given the name Despair. And so because of the fact that the Martian was supposed to meet back up with John, right, the two of them were supposed to come back together once the day was over, the Martian's been missing for a week, and John doesn't know where the Martian is. He doesn't know that Martian has basically been taken by the Agency and is quite literally being experimented on. Instead, his interactions with Despair start off almost innocuous. They almost start off very, very basic. And for those of you guys who struggle with like anxiety or depression or a combination of both, you're gonna find a lot of common ground here. As a guy who has historically struggled with that, it's always that way. It starts off very, very small and basic, and then it becomes something much bigger, like that. And that's exactly what happens here. That much like we're used to when John Jones travels around and he sees people's thoughts, which are provided to us as the audience in the form of like smoke with written words, so we can get this really like fever dream depiction of how telepathy works. John ends up showing up and visiting a couple different people just because of the fact that one of them has dreamed about the Martian. Because keep in mind, anything the Martian sees, as long as John is connected to it, John sees as well. So quite literally, he's just tracking down leads, trying to figure out where the Martian's at. But Despair is here the entire time. And this couple has problems. And the funny thing about this is we're given this kind of physical depiction of a metaphorical situation, which is to say cracks in the house. The house isn't quite literally cracking, but it's designed to represent the struggle of their marriage, in the sense that the Despair says she doesn't respect him and he doesn't trust her. This whole marriage is on shaky ground. So the cracks in the house is a reflection of the fact that the marriage is quite literally falling apart at the seams. But what's so interesting about Despair is he doesn't lie. Instead, what Despair does is kind of twist the truth to a degree and then present it to John. And here's what I mean. There's a point when they're leaving the house and it turns out this couple has a kid. And when Despair just touches both of these individuals, he says, this is never going to work. Nothing ever does. So there's a lot of doubt that he's creating in the minds of the people that he impacts. And he tells John, I see the truth in everything. Sorry if I hit a nerve, Mr. Sensitive. Because John kind of makes this argument where he says, like, sorry to bother you guys, because the reality is normal people cannot see Despair. They don't know he's there. But as they're leaving, they pass the kid of this couple. And Despair says, it's the son that I really feel sorry for. A choice between a toxic home life and a broken home is no choice at all. Both put him at higher risk for addiction, homelessness, and prison. You name it. He's gonna suffer from any number of these things. There was also an instance where before the Martian was captured, that John was watching what the Martian was doing, kind of keeping it in the back of his head. And the Martian had come across a guy who secretly had 3 families in this town of Middleton, where the whole comic takes place. And once they pick back up with this guy, because again, he's experienced possession by the Martian, Despair says, the man with 3 families. Now he's the man with no families. And the guy in this drunken state starts babbling on about how he texted the wrong picture to the wrong wife. And that's when they realized that this guy was manipulating a whole bunch of women and had families with each one of them, that they're gonna take his kids and that his whole life has been destroyed. But the whole time, Despair kind of chimes in behind the scenes. Isn't this so pathetically cliche? You want to set yourself on fire, right? Talking about this particular guy. And where John tells this guy, I'm here to talk to you about your dreams, and then thinks to himself, the Martian would probably call this a bad idea and give it some kind of a number. Despair chimes in, no, not an idea, more of a state of mind. I am Despair the Zero, your new partner, right? Your last best friend, the only one that you will ever need. And that, in a lot of ways, is how people feel when they struggle with anxiety and depression. It's all encompassing. It overtakes you. And John initially tries to resist it, right? You are not my friend. And just kind of like brushes Despair to the side. But Despair never leaves. Instead, John hands his card down to this guy and just says, call me if you dream green again. And so that's where Despair is kind of honest with him, right? He says, I am here to destroy you, John, physically, mentally, spiritually, and through you, your entire mundane reality. I'm not like the last guy. I will always be honest with you, partner. I promise. Somebody has to be, right? And that's the crack. That's the way that Despair gets in. Because John's response to this isn't like, oh man, this guy's so full of crap. The response that he has, what's that supposed to mean? So it's not as though he takes Despair seriously on a conscious level, but on a subconscious level. He thinks there might be something to what Despair is saying. And so at that point, there's another person who had experienced an instance with the Martian, a man on death row. And we end up finding out directly from Despair what it was that he did that landed him here. And while the guy's not necessarily really able to give any meaningful information to John Jones about where the Martian may be, Despair says this guy killed a woman and 2 elderly security guards in an armed robbery gone wrong. Blood and crying grandkids everywhere. And of course, this entire segment is cut short when John ends up going to the couple's therapy session. And this is where what little resistance he had against Despair completely overtakes him. Because what happens is that as he's driving to this location, Despair says, do you ever have the urge as you idle into work to twist into oncoming traffic? Walking into your therapist's office, do you picture yourself swallowing your sidearm and saving yourself the copay? Do you ever ponder the darkness? And so where he finally shows up here in this therapy session, there's a lot of doubt and uncertainty, because a lot of this seems to feed into this notion of like guys seeking help for mental health, right? That it's still very much a kind of stigma. And so this uncertainty is in a lot of ways built on by Despair. You should have swerved into traffic, John. You would have saved yourself some suffering, which is what you are going to endure. And so because of the distrust that he has with the entire situation with therapy, he doesn't necessarily want to be there. When the therapist sits down and says, do you know why we're here today, John? His response, yes, to fix our marriage, to get our family back to normal again. And that's when Despair chimes in. They've got you here under false pretenses, pal. That woman is no healer. Her mouth is full of knives. And that's when you find out that Bridget had told the therapist that, quote unquote, John talks to Martians, which is how she interpreted what it was that he said when he was possessed by the Martian and was filling her in on what was going on. Because keep in mind, he was all over the place. He was very erratic in his behavior. She didn't understand it. And so when he explained it, she thought he was crazy. And Despair chimes in. She betrayed you, John, right? That's the secret shared between the two of you. And she told the therapist, you can't trust her, man. And it even tells him, right, kill the doctor, John, before it's too late. And John just shouts, no. But seemingly it comes in response to the question, is the Martian in the room with us right now? John. Now, the thing about this is the therapist kind of seems a little condescending, or at least that's how John interprets it. And what's interesting here is that while John grabbed Bridget and Tyler and moved them to this town, right, moved them to Middleton, in a lot of ways, Bridget didn't necessarily know why. It was just John saying, I've been transferred, and not really giving her any information. We as the audience didn't really even have the information. And so in the midst of all of this, Despair is like, you know what, let's take a look. Because when John says, I admit I've been weird ever since I got to that coffee shop, which was seemingly when he first encountered the Martian Manhunter, the response of Bridget, no, you were weird before we came to Middleton. You were weird when we initially left the job. When Despair goes into the head of John, we get this brief glimpse, this kind of moment where he's told, you can be charged with bribery, corruption, and conspiracy, or you can save us all some embarrassment, take the transfer, and disappear. And so that's where he just says, nothing happened in DC, right? Again, lying to his family, lying to himself. And Despair says that, right? You're getting so good at lying, John, you almost had me convinced, and I live in your head. And so because Tyler is currently just outside the room, right? Because this is supposed to be a family therapy session, but the goal is to talk to John and to talk to Bridget before Tyler's brought in to get a better idea of what's going on with this bigger picture. John says, right, I want to see my son. This is supposed to be a therapy session. And Despair tells him, right, they're never going to let you see your son again, John. And the therapist says, right, Agent Jones, I believe you're in the midst of a massive psychotic break. Your symptoms are classically schizophrenic. The voices, the power, quote unquote, the aliens, shadows, and shades. Despair chimes in and says, they're going to cut your brain out, man, and replace it with one that works, right? They think you have a problem. They think you're a problematic person. And that's where John starts to succumb to the influence of Despair, that when he stands up and is like, no, I'm not doing this, right? The therapist is like, you're in the grip of a delusion, right? You're dangerous with the way you're acting. John's response is like, do you really think that I would hurt my son? And then in turn, lashes out at Bridget, right? You said that this was going to be emergency surgery to save our marriage. That's what you said on the phone. This feels like a funeral. This entire therapy session feels like all you're trying to do is build a case for why it is that this whole marriage should end in the first place. You just don't want to feel like the bad guy. And so that's where he says, but you, if you were acting of your own accord, if you were really Bridget, you wouldn't be doing this, right? You would have told me this on the phone, right? And that's where Bridget says, I'm desperate, John. I don't know what to do. But you can see how it's all coming together here. Despair is convincing John that Bridget isn't Bridget. But when you scale out and you remove Despair from this equation, all you have here is John Jones in a couples therapy session with Bridget and the therapist, and John starts making outrageous claims. You've been possessed. Aliens have taken over you. Something's influencing you. And all of these claims are being made by a man who told his wife, I am possessed by aliens. It makes him look insane. It really does make him look like a person struggling with schizophrenia, but all the while being manipulated behind the scenes. Despair says, you're right, John. I can show you if you want. Martian vision is on the fritz, but I think you're ready for something better. See existence for the painful, empty thing it really is. See people's true colors, blue, sadness, misery, despair. Comprehend the sinister meaning behind every seemingly innocuous statement or action. And that's when you really see what's happening here, that everything Bridget says is twisted by despair in the mind of John. When Bridget says, I'm doing this because I love you, what John is told by despair, the true meaning of it, I don't love you, John. I never did, right? And he says, see how people see you, how they've always seen you, and how they always will see you. And so in this belief that he's being manipulated by his wife, being tricked, right, into appearing here and giving her the kind of ammunition she needs to kill the marriage, he goes running out of the room, right? And then like runs up on Tyler. Now, he sees what's actually happening with Tyler, that Tyler's possessed by the White Martian. but no one else can see that. He's the only one that has any vision of it. So in his mind, he sees his son possessed. And it is true, his son is possessed, but in the mind of everybody else, they just see him being crazy and they just see Tyler sitting there. And so again, Bridget shows up here and she says, he's been so much better, John, so much better since you've been gone. He started talking. He talks to me all the time now. What John is told by Despair is Bridget saying, you were the problem. We're better off without you. You see what's going on here. You see the manipulation happening with Despair. And so literally John takes off out of this place as fast as he possibly can. And again, experience after experience after experience is him being shown by Despair a false reality. Despair taking the way the world looks and then manipulating it behind the scenes and essentially tricking John into believing a false narrative about that world. Now, as far as the Martian himself goes, with the agency experimenting on the Martian, they deduce pretty quickly that the Martian has an anchor to the real world, someone he's attached to, and they figure out that person is John Jones. So what they end up doing is dispatching Rainbow Agent. This is a guy who is quite literally a kind of hippie, I guess maybe turned soldier, is kind of hard to describe him, but in essence, he's a guy that has telepathy, right, psychic abilities, and he can quite literally manifest physical soldiers that fight on his behalf. And that's what he does, right? They literally show up, at least from Rainbow Agent, and they confront John Jones. But the other part of this is that as far as Bridget is concerned, John's right when he says that she is not herself, that what Tyler's been doing since he's possessed by the White Martian has been slowly influencing Bridget, manipulating her. But because she doesn't actually see the White Martian, because all she sees is Tyler, she doesn't really know what's going on here. But then over time, that influence starts to crack and it starts to break in the sense that she knows something's off. She knows something's not quite right, but she can't quite figure out what it is. And so switching back over to John, when he's finally captured by the Rainbow Agent, he's literally brought to a firing squad, right? He's going to be executed, as crazy as that sounds. But during the agency experimenting on the Martian, there was a point when they quite literally cut him open while he was alive, and all these butterflies came flying out, and one of the agents torched the butterflies. I know it sounds crazy to say it, but that's literally what happens. But one of the butterflies escaped, and it literally heads straight for John, because what the Martian's been trying to do is get a hold of John this entire time. So while he's quite literally facing a firing squad, the butterfly flies into his mouth and protects him from death. And so in the face of that, John just flees. He jumps in a car and takes off as fast as humanly possible to find the Martian. And that's kind of the insanity behind it all, because the Martian is being held in a place called Nihilo Bay, which seemingly exists in a pocket dimension that's inside of a black hole. Nothing gets in or out outside of the ability to open a portal and to teleport there. So that's why the Martian wasn't really able to communicate with John in a meaningful way, because thoughts, lights, energy, whatever, nothing gets out of this place. But because John was literally able to jump through this location, quite literally using his metaphysical connection to the Martian, when he shows up here, he's confronted by all these agents, but all he's trying to do is rescue the Manhunter. And so he starts fighting his way through all these guys, right? Cracking them over the skulls and giving them elbows to the face, just fighting for dear life. And then finally, he lays his hand on the Martian. And in that moment, in touching him with a finger, the two of them are reunited. And the Martian is yanked back into the mind of John Jones. But the kicker is Despair is still here. So technically, he's possessed by both. And so while they do escape and they end up back in Middleton, which kind of seems abandoned, but not necessarily, they are caught up to by the agency. And then a fight breaks out between all of them. But the reality here is, because we're talking about beings as powerful as both the Martian Manhunter and Despair, both of whom have the ability to manipulate the thoughts and motivations of others, the fight comes to an end pretty fast, in the sense that one of the agents is like forced to unalive themselves. And while there is collateral damage in the shootout, the goal of John and the Martian and Despair isn't to destroy anybody. It's to literally play defense and get away as fast as they possibly can. And so while the Martian is dealing with Rainbow Agent, Despair gets his clutches back into John Jones again, trying to sway John away from the Martian and back to his side, because again, the entire motivation of Despair is to destroy John on a psychological level. And so what he does is he takes John down his own life and says, you think think the Martian only recently became a part of your life. No. That's not the way that it is. He says, look back on your life, John. See what was always there and what you were missing. He's been with you since the day you were born. Every decision you thought you made, he made for you. That green and red thread running through your head. He's been manipulating you your entire life. So the goal is to sow distrust, because he says everything the Martian did was to get you to that coffee shop on that particular day. You are not the driver. You're a passenger, a prisoner on death row. And in fact, he ends up grabbing John and taking him to Derek, the guy that they had talked to on death row earlier, when he's about to be unalived. And what's interesting here is, again, despair never lies. Despair just kind of twists things around a little bit. And I guess maybe depending on who you're talking to, it may all be the same thing. But he actually makes a very salient point here that John is the one who's lying, and John's lying to himself. Because once Martian Manhunter essentially destroys Rainbow Agent, there's only one person left, and they're literally just trying to get out of there as fast as they can, which means Martian Manhunter is going to find John. But until the two of them reunite, despair forces John to analyze the character of Derek. And John says, like, I don't want to see this, right? It's almost like the guards are giddy, right? They're excited to unalive this guy. And that's where despair says, too bad, John. You are part of this. You've killed in the line of duty. Heck, you've probably sent a few guys to the executioner yourself. And John's response, no, right? I didn't want to do that. I didn't make them do that. Their choices put them there, not me. I'm not responsible for the things that they've done. And that's where despair's like, who would choose to be here? John, would you choose to be here? You think that you have hold of your life when so much is out of your control. I mean, let's change a few parts of Derek's past and see if anything is different here. Let's erase the years of physical and emotional abuse and resulting changes in brain chemistry. Let's heal the untreated head injury. Forget the lifetime of poverty, deprivation, everyday racism, his brother's death at a very young age. Let's erase his mother's addictions and generations of preceding trauma. And that's when you end up seeing that Derek would have had a very different life. Right? Derek didn't choose to be here, that his actions, the things that he did, were a result of everything that happened to him over the course of his life. So it's simply just to say, life's not as simple. It's not as binary or black and white as everything that a person does is a personal choice. In some ways, sure, but those personal choices are often driven by personal experiences, and those personal experiences change people on a very fundamental level. And so in hearing all of this, despair says, did you know that judges give harsher sentences when they're hungry? Poor Derek here died because his judge missed breakfast that morning. And so despair asks him, right? You're always asking yourself questions like, why do people do what they do? Well, that's you, isn't it? Right? But you know the answer. You just refuse to accept what it means. Is it really a choice if you can only ever choose the one way? There's no such thing as choice, John. Everything you are, everything you do, it's all predetermined by forces completely beyond your control or understanding. Free will is a fairy tale. So quite literally, he's just demoralizing John at this point. What he's trying to do is twist John's perception of reality towards nihilism, right? That it's meaningless, that when it comes to trying to make your own choices about what you do in the world, you're raging against the dying of the light. It's a fool's errand, right? That's really the argument he's making here. So again, it's very much trying to instill depression, fear, and doubt within the mind of John. And so when John just kind of goes running out of this space and ends up out there in his own mindscape, right? Just like struggling over everything that's going on, being manipulated by despair. And the biggest fear he has is that he's losing his wife and his child. That despair builds on this. Tyler is dead, John. He died months ago, poisoned. Not a pretty way to go, right? And John's terrified, right? He says no. Now, of course, again, manipulation. None of what John is hearing here is real. Tyler's not dead. But despair tells him, you are not the savior, the destroyer if you're lucky. But don't worry, that was not your choice either. And so Bridget, basically runs up on John because John's just kind of out here in the city collapsed, going crazy due to everything that Despair's doing behind the scenes. But Bridget had figured out there was something wrong with Tyler. She didn't know what it is, but she knew he was manipulating her in some capacity. So the only thing she could do was run. And so when Bridget runs up on John, Despair continues on. Did you think all these cracks were just in your head? Well, they were, but not anymore, because what happens in your head also happens in the real world. Because quite literally, reality is falling apart at the seams, because the narrative that we're being given here, right, the story that we're being told is that John himself is an anchor to reality. If John dies, reality goes with it. Now, we don't really know why that's the case, but it just seems to be the role he plays. And so at that point, you just like jump over to this kind of scenario where John is literally at a funeral, and the funeral is for Tyler. Now again, this is happening in John's head. This whole funeral segment, be aware, this is inside of his own mind. This is Despair screwing with him. In reality, John's just laying out there in the city, and Bridget's trying to tend to him and bring him back as best she can. And so in essence, it's almost like he's having a panic attack in some ways, because he asked the question of Despair, who's in the casket? And Despair just says, you know who, John, right? The party is just getting going now, right here at the end. Ice ages clatter and crystal glasses. You can hear the music, a mix of screaming babies freshly ripped from their mothers and inhuman throat sounds ripped from a million years before or after language, all over everywhere at once. It's the kind of tune that gets stuck in your head and you can't get it out without a kitchen knife. Am I right? And so that's where Despair basically kind of appears out here and then gives a knife directly to Bridget and just says, here you go. And for the first time, Bridget starts seeing what's going on. She sees Despair. And even when the Martian shows up, she sees him. Her experience with the White Martian has actually given her the ability to see what John sees to a degree. She doesn't really see people's words coming out of their heads, but she does see the fact that everything John's been saying is real. And so she looks at Despair and asks, who are you, right? What are you? And Despair just says, I'm your husband's work husband, right? I am John's partner. Call me Despair the Zero. And she says, he sounds like my grandmother, the way she just cheerfully picks you apart. And that's where Bridget's just kind of like, John's Martian, but like no, none of this is real. And so she asks, like, what's happening to him? And Despair just says, it's not indigestion. I'll tell you that. John is dying, Bridget, and he's going to take all of reality with him unless you put an end to it. The only way to save all of creation is for you to unalive your husband. And in that moment, the Martian Manhunter appears and basically goes to fight against Despair while Bridget watches all of this insanity unfold. And so while the two of them are fighting, Despair keeps telling Bridget, right, you can save everyone, you can save the world. All you have to do is just destroy John. That's it. And so in this moment, when Bridget, in a kind of moment of panic, slashes at Despair and his arm quite literally gets cut off, Despair momentarily retreats and the Manhunter just says, we're going to do the one thing we should have done at the beginning of all of this. And you and I might call it something like a mind meld, but it's basically John and Bridget being able to see each other's lives, being able to, for the very first time, communicate on a very fundamental level. He sees her life and she sees his, not in terms of what they've said and what they're aware of from how each other has explained their lives, but actually feeling the moment, seeing that person in that moment of their life, right? Not only that, the White Martian's influence is spreading. And so one of the things that I want to point out here is that where there are statements about how people are kind of in this giant conga line, right, stretching all the way into existence, it's not literal. This is not the ending of the movie Us, right? Hands across America. That's not really what's happening here. Instead, this is designed to be a representation of the fact that the influence of the White Martian is growing again, and more than it did in the first volume of the story. It's influencing and impacting and controlling every single person across the world and really across all of existence, the universe itself. But for what end? What's the goal? Well, we'll find that out here in a second. But as far as John and Bridget go, when they experience each other's lives, we get this kind of depiction of how it all started for John, specifically from the perspective of the Manhunter, who, as far as Despair's statements go, was accurate, that he's actually been with John since the beginning, right? That the Martian Manhunter was there when the egg was fertilized by the sperm. I hear muffled voices in high, happy tones as though underwater, feeling of warmth and the certainty that I'm not alone, the blurred consciousness of a baby, then a big wet bang, pressure and light, and something strange filling my lungs. Air. In an instant, the world becomes something new and incomprehensible. And so he's born out there into the world, and the Manhunter is there with him the entire time. But then you switch over to the perspective of Bridget, the life that she experienced. John being aware of the fact that she came from a very tragic household, but actually experiencing it for the very first time. Her parents arguing and fighting one another, the fear that it's her fault that it's happening. This kind of communion between the two of them is what they needed the entire time. Not hearing each other, but truly and meaningfully understanding each other. But at the same time that all this is going on, cracks are forming in reality. The universe, the world is all starting to fall apart. And that's when you realize that the target here of the White Martian is language. It's destroying the very thing that people use to communicate with one another. Because if people cannot talk, then people cannot create an illusion, right? The illusion being how people see the world and how they communicate their perception of the world with other people. And that's why it says, protective blindness, illusion, reality, shadowy. He, I, we are aware of strange things happening all over the world. For a while, 1 + 1 = 86. Anti-life arithmetic. In Gotham, an engineer working the night shift keeps doing the calculations, but they are not making sense. Tyler's party congas through Tokyo, and to celebrate, the entire city spontaneously becomes one perfectly choreographed dance. No one has stopped since they began, not for water or for the toilet or to rest. 14 million dancers and growing. So far, 29 people have died from exhaustion. Their bodies lie on the ground, unattended, trampled flat by graceful, synchronized steps. So now, the White Martian's actions are becoming reality. More so than that, John begins to see the world through the eyes of Bridget. That Tyler, at a very young age, before he was ever possessed by the White Martian, never really spoke. He never really talked. Bridget had legitimate concerns about this. We need to get him tested. We need to look into this. John was kind of dismissive. Oh, he's just a late bloomer. That's it. Not a great big huge deal. But Bridget ended up quitting her job as a lawyer and staying home to take care of Tyler. That it weighed on her. It was a lot of work to focus on Tyler by herself, trying to find ways to communicate with her son because he didn't necessarily speak. And John was blissfully unaware of it because he wasn't there for it. He was hyper-focused on his job. And that's what we're told. Language is important. The written word is an early casualty. Sentences stop making sense. Characters explode into meaninglessness. A man made of dust, stars, and sadness is troubled by the loss of language. He's enjoyed all 50 of the ones he's learned. He watches electrons wobble in their orbits and atomic bonds begin to break and feels an old, familiar fear as his stomach makes noises like a dying world. And we're told, Tyler arrives, although now I see there's something else in him, some thin white thing coiled like smoke inside my son, followed by a parade of humanity's worst ideas. It feels like the last New Year's Eve counting down to nothing. And Tyler needs help. And again, that's where John continues to experience the world from the perspective of Bridget, and where Bridget experiences the world from the perspective of John, over and over and over again. Bridget feeling the pain that John felt when she rebuked his statement about being possessed by a Martian, refusing to trust him when all of it was true. But all those feelings of Bridget were coming from a place of resentment because she's the one who quit her job. She's the one that stayed home to take care of Tyler. She's the one that moved on a whim without knowing the full picture of what was going on with John because she loved him, but feeling as though both she and Tyler were being neglected by John every step of the way. And so at the end of all of this, John is forced to come to grips with his biggest fears. He's forced to come to grips with his own past mistakes, his impatience, yelling at Tyler for not being able to talk, use your words, screaming at him, that kind of thing. The fact that he was so neglectful towards his son. The fact that Tyler stood out in the rain for 4 hours because John forgot to pick him up. The fact that he has been, historically, a terrible father to his son, that he wasn't really there when his son needed him to be. And that was always the biggest source of power for the White Martian. It's what the White Martian fed on. This entire time, it's been using Tyler because Tyler is the source of guilt for John. The anchor was John the whole time. And so once he comes to terms with this, once he accepts the fact that he wasn't the father that he could have been, and once he accepts the fact that he still can be a better father, the White Martian's hold breaks. And that's what allows the Martian Manhunter to destroy the White Martian, or at least defeat him momentarily, because seemingly the White Martian kind of represents the core source of every ounce of anxiety and anger and wrath that anybody can experience. But more so than that, the White Martian comes from a source. And we're told the White Martian is an anti-life entity, but at the very center of him, them, is you, is life, leaving him open to the full spectrum, life trap, swallowed by all-consuming, all-creating mouth of God, devil and dark, divided, transformed, spun back out, and trapped, part of every living thing in creation. Because what's being referenced here is Darkseid, the source and the creator of the absolute universe. And so as this starts to come to a close, because the White Martian's influence is no longer a part of the world, at least in the tangible way that it has been, and because of the fact that it's left Tyler, and now John, no longer feeling this guilt, can start reconciling with his family, all things look like they're going back to rights. The world has returned to a state of normalcy. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. This was a maxi series. This is the final issue of Absolute Martian Manhunter, but I gotta tell you guys, this is a generational run. It's one of the greatest comics that has ever been written in the history of DC. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.